Bobby Sullivan dropped his morning coffee, the ceramic mug shattering against the kitchen floor as his trembling fingers released their grip. The Willowbrook Gazette's headline blazed across the front page in bold black letters. Miracle Dog Saves Autistic Child from Drowning. The same animal nearly put down 6 months ago. It wasn't possible. Not Thor. His neighbor Dorothy Henderson burst through the unlocked front door, her face flushed with excitement, newspaper clutched against her chest like a sacred text. "Bobby! Bobby, did you see? Our Thor, he's a hero! That sweet boy saved little Sophie Webb from the quarry." Her voice cracked with emotion as tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. Bobby stared at the photograph beneath the headline. Thor, magnificent and proud, standing beside a smiling 10-year-old girl, both of them alive, both of them safe. 6 months ago, this same dog had been scheduled for euthanasia, labeled aggressive and irredeemable. "Call the shelter," Bobby whispered, his heart pounding against his ribs. "We need to know everything." How had the most hated dog in Willowbrook become its greatest hero? What had really happened at that quarry? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The story had begun 6 months earlier on a January morning so cold that Bobby Sullivan's breath formed clouds in his unheated kitchen. At 65, the retired elementary school teacher sat alone at a table that had once hosted 40 years of family breakfasts, now set for one. Martha's empty chair across from him seemed to mock his solitude, a daily reminder of the lung cancer that had stolen his wife 3 years prior. Willowbrook, Pennsylvania, bore the scars of America's industrial decline. Once a thriving steel town of 12,000, it had withered to barely 8,000 souls after the mill's closure in 2008. Main Street's storefronts stood half empty, their windows reflecting the struggles of families who couldn't afford to leave and couldn't afford to stay. The Willowbrook Animal Shelter, a converted warehouse on the town's outskirts, faced its own death sentence. Budget cuts threatened closure within 90 days. Bobby fingered the amber pill bottle beside his coffee cup, the same prescription that had eased Martha's final weeks. 40 OxyContin tablets. Enough to join her, he'd calculated. The mathematics teacher in him had always been precise about such things. His teacher's pension barely covered the mortgage on their 1950s ranch house, and the loneliness had become a physical ache that worsened each morning. 2 blocks away, Dorothy Henderson swept her front porch with methodical determination. At 72, Dot had perfected the art of productive worry. Her late husband Harold's flag hung crisp in the winter air, honoring 30 years of marriage to a man who'd returned from Vietnam carrying invisible wounds. She understood damaged souls, had spent 3 decades as a psychiatric nurse before retirement, and now volunteered 10 hours weekly at the struggling animal shelter. In the shelter's isolation wing, a 4-year-old German shepherd named Thor pressed himself against the concrete wall of kennel number 17. His black and tan coat bore the evidence of his mysterious past, a distinctive white scar across his left eye, smaller marks along his flanks that spoke of deliberate cruelty. For 8 months, he had watched potential families approach his cage, only to retreat when staff members whispered warnings about his incidents. 3 failed adoptions had earned him the unofficial title of Most Dangerous Dog in Willowbrook. Dr. Marcus Webb's veterinary clinic occupied a prime corner of Main Street, its success a stark contrast to the failing businesses surrounding it. At 48, Webb commanded respect as the town's only veterinarian, though few knew about the crushing debt from his daughter Sophie's autism treatments. His ex-wife had fled to California 2 years earlier, leaving him to navigate single parenthood while maintaining his professional facade. 10-year-old Sophie Webb sat in her father's waiting room, methodically arranging colored pencils by shade. Her high-functioning autism demanded order in a world that felt perpetually chaotic. She hadn't spoken about the incident that had separated her from her former therapy dog, the German Shepherd, who had once been her constant companion during the darkest moments of her young life. That morning, as Bobby contemplated his final exit, none of them could have imagined how their fractured lives would soon intertwine around one unwanted dog's desperate need for redemption. The newspaper headline about the shelter's impending closure slipped from Bobby's fingers like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Martha's voice echoed in his memory, words she'd spoken during her final week. "Every soul deserves saving, Bobby, even the broken ones. Especially the broken ones." He swept the pill bottle into his kitchen drawer with sudden determination and reached for his winter coat. The Willowbrook Animal Shelter smelled of industrial disinfectant and desperation. Jennifer Walsh, the 28-year-old shelter manager, looked up from a stack of euthanization orders as Bobby entered the lobby. Her red-rimmed eyes suggested she'd been crying over each signature required by the county's directive. Dot Henderson emerged from the volunteer storage room, her arms full of threadbare towels that she'd been washing and folding for the third time that week. "Bobby Sullivan," Dot said, genuine surprise warming her voice. "Haven't seen you here since Martha's time." She remembered how Martha had volunteered during her chemotherapy treatments, finding comfort in caring for abandoned animals while fighting her own battle. "I want to adopt a dog," Bobby announced, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "Not just any dog. I want your most difficult case, the one nobody else will take." Jennifer's pen stopped mid-signature. In 8 years of shelter work, she'd heard many requests, but never this one. "Mr. Sullivan, I appreciate the gesture, but our difficult cases are difficult for serious reasons. We have liability concerns, insurance issues." "Dorothy," Bobby interrupted, turning to his neighbor. "You know me. You knew Martha. Have I ever backed down from a challenge that mattered?" Dot studied his face, recognizing something she hadn't seen since Martha's funeral: purpose. As a former psychiatric nurse, she'd learned to read the difference between a cry for help and a genuine commitment to healing. "Show him Thor," she said quietly. The isolation wing occupied the shelter's rear section, separated from the adoption kennels by 2 sets of steel doors. Warning signs plastered Thor's kennel. "Dangerous animal, authorized personnel only." Inside the 10-by-6 concrete cell, the German Shepherd pressed himself against the far wall, his powerful frame reduced to defensive angles. The white scar across his left eye caught the fluorescent light, and smaller marks along his ribs told stories that no one wanted to imagine. "He's been here 8 months, Jennifer explained, her voice dropping to a whisper. 3 separate adoption attempts, 3 returns. The last family brought him back after he snapped at their teenage son. Before that, he growled at a postal worker. The first family said he was unpredictable around men." Bobby lowered himself to the concrete floor outside the kennel, ignoring the protest from his arthritic knees. He didn't make eye contact with Thor, instead gazing at his own weathered hands. "I taught elementary school for 40 years, he said softly, as much to himself as to the dog. "Know what I learned? The kids who acted out the worst were usually the ones hurting the most." Thor's ears twitched at the gentle tone, though he remained pressed against the wall. Something in Bobby's posture, non-threatening, patient, differed from the other humans who'd approached his cage with either fear or false enthusiasm. "My wife Martha used to say that broken things could be fixed if you were willing to take the time," Bobby continued. "She was talking about an old rocking chair, but I think she meant more than that." He slowly extended his hand, palm up near the kennel bars, not reaching through, simply offering. Minutes passed in silence. Jennifer shifted nervously, checking her watch and calculating the insurance liability of this encounter. Dot watched with the practiced patience of someone who'd spent decades coaxing traumatized minds back to trust. Then, almost imperceptibly, Thor lifted his head. His amber eyes met Bobby's for the first time, and something passed between them, a recognition that transcended species. Both had known loss. Both carried scars that went deeper than flesh. Thor rose slowly, his movements careful and calculated. He approached the bars with the hesitation of a soul who'd learned that hope often led to disappointment. When he reached Bobby's outstretched hand, he paused, nostrils flaring as he processed the scent of grief, loneliness, and something else, genuine kindness without expectation. The moment Thor's nose touched Bobby's palm, Jennifer gasped. "He's never done that." Not with anyone. The connection lasted only seconds before Thor retreated, but it was enough. Bobby felt something he hadn't experienced since Martha's death, the possibility of purpose beyond his own pain. "I'll take him," Bobby said, struggling to his feet. "Mr. Sullivan, you don't understand the legal implications," Jennifer protested. "The liability waivers alone—" "I understand perfectly," Bobby replied. "I understand that dog has been failed by every human who promised to care for him. I understand that he's scheduled to die because no one wants to put in the work to heal him. And I understand that sometimes the best teachers come in unexpected forms." The adoption paperwork took 2 hours. Bobby signed every waiver, every release, every document that transferred responsibility for Thor's actions to his shoulders alone. Jennifer tried repeatedly to dissuade him, citing the dog's history and the potential dangers. Dot remained silent until Bobby reached the final signature. "You sure about this, Bobby?" she asked. "That dog's been through trauma we can only guess at. Healing him might break your heart all over again." Bobby set down the pen and looked through the window toward Thor's kennel. "Dorothy, my heart's already broken. Has been for 3 years. Maybe it's time to see if 2 broken things can help each other heal." As they prepared to leave, Dr. Webb's burgundy Mercedes pulled into the shelter parking lot. He emerged with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room, medical bag in hand for his monthly volunteer inspection. His eyes narrowed when he spotted Thor walking beside Bobby on a sturdy leash. "That animal should not be leaving this facility," Webb declared, striding toward them. "I've documented multiple incidents of aggressive behavior. He's a liability to public safety." "Dr. Webb," Dot interjected, "the adoption's been processed legally. Mr. Sullivan has assumed full responsibility." Webb's jaw tightened as he studied Thor, who had instinctively positioned himself between Bobby and the veterinarian. "Some animals can't be rehabilitated, Mr. Sullivan. Sometimes the kindest thing is knowing when to let go." "Funny," Bobby replied, his teacher's instincts recognizing a bully when he saw one. "I always believed the opposite, that giving up on someone or something said more about us than them." As they drove away, Thor trembled in the back seat of Bobby's aging Subaru, watching the only home he'd known for 8 months disappear behind them. Neither dog nor man could have anticipated that their fragile new bond would soon be tested by forces determined to tear them apart. 3 weeks into February, Bobby's morning routine had evolved around Thor's careful boundaries. The German Shepherd would enter the house only after Bobby had been inside for 10 minutes, would eat only when Bobby retreated to the living room, and slept on the kitchen floor rather than accept the expensive orthopedic bed Bobby had purchased. Progress measured in inches, but progress nonetheless. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when Bobby discovered something that changed everything. While cleaning Thor's collar, a frayed canvas affair from the shelter, his fingers detected a hard lump beneath the fabric. Curious, he worked the object free and found himself staring at a small metal disc, tarnished but unmistakably military in origin. The words U.S. Army K-9 Course encircled a service number with Therapy Dog Certified stamped below. "You weren't an attack dog at all, were you?" Bobby whispered, examining the tag by his kitchen window. Thor watched from his usual position by the back door, head tilted as if understanding the significance of the discovery. "You were trained to help people heal." That afternoon, Bobby visited the Willowbrook Public Library and spent 3 hours researching military working dogs on their aging computer. What he discovered made his stomach turn. Thor's service number traced to a therapy dog program for soldiers with PTSD, specifically trained for work with traumatized children. Dogs like Thor underwent 2 years of specialized training, learning to recognize panic attacks, provide pressure therapy, and remain calm in chaotic situations. The question that haunted Bobby was simple. How does a certified therapy dog end up labeled as dangerous in a small-town shelter? His research was interrupted by a commotion in the library's main aisle. Dr. Webb's voice carried across the quiet space, his tone sharp with authority. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm telling you that Animal poses a significant risk to our community. 3 documented incidents of aggression, and now he's living 2 blocks from the elementary school." Bobby peered around the computer terminal to see Webb addressing Carol Patterson, the school's guidance counselor. A small crowd had gathered, including several parents Bobby recognized from his teaching days. "Dr. Webb," Carol replied diplomatically, "the adoption was legal. Mr. Sullivan has always been responsible." "Responsibility doesn't matter when a child gets mauled," Webb interrupted. "I've seen what dogs like that can do. I won't stand by and watch this community put children at risk because of misplaced sentiment." Bobby felt heat rise in his chest, the same protective anger he'd experienced when parents had unfairly criticized his students. He stood slowly, his teacher's instincts recognizing a moment that required intervention. "Marcus," Bobby said, using Webb's first name deliberately, "might I ask what specific incidents you're referring to?" The library fell silent as Webb turned, his face flushing slightly at being challenged publicly. The shelter has documented that Thor was returned by 3 families," Bobby corrected, his voice carrying the authority of 4 decades in classrooms. "But documentation and understanding are different things. Did anyone investigate why those incidents occurred?" Webb's eyes narrowed. "Are you questioning my professional assessment?" "I'm questioning any assessment made without complete information." Bobby pulled Thor's military tag from his pocket, letting it catch the light. "Did you know Thor was a certified therapy dog, trained specifically to work with traumatized children?" The crowd murmured, several parents leaning closer to examine the tag. Carol Patterson's eyebrows rose with genuine surprise. "A therapy dog." "But the shelter said—" "The shelter repeated what they were told," Bobby replied, his gaze fixed on Webb. "But someone's story doesn't match the evidence." Webb's face had gone pale, his jaw working silently for several seconds. "Military dogs wash out for various reasons. Training doesn't guarantee temperament." "True," Bobby agreed. "But it raises questions, like why a therapy dog would suddenly become aggressive, or why no one mentioned his specialized training when he arrived at the shelter." The tension stretched until Carol Patterson stepped forward. "Mr. Sullivan, would you be willing to bring Thor to the school for an evaluation? We have protocols for therapy animals." "Absolutely not." Webb's voice cracked like a whip. "I will not allow that animal near children based on a piece of metal and wishful thinking." "It's not your decision to make," Bobby replied quietly. "But I appreciate Dr. Webb's concern for child safety." It's admirable when someone cares so deeply about protecting children. Something in Bobby's tone made Webb's face flush darker. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Simply that your passion for this issue suggests personal experience, Sometimes our strongest reactions come from our deepest wounds. The library crowd shifted uncomfortably as the conversation took on an edge. Neither man seemed willing to acknowledge directly. Webb grabbed his medical bag with sharp, angry movements. "Mark my words, Sullivan. When that dog hurts someone, and he will, the blood will be on your hands." He strode toward the exit, then paused at the door. "Some things can't be fixed. Some damage is permanent." After Webb left, the remaining parents clustered around Bobby, examining Thor's tag and asking questions about therapy dogs. Several shared stories of their own children's struggles, autism, anxiety, ADHD, and wondered aloud whether animal therapy might help. That evening, as Bobby prepared Thor's dinner, he noticed the dog's behavior had shifted. Instead of waiting for Bobby to retreat, Thor approached the food bowl while Bobby remained nearby. When their eyes met, Thor's tail gave a single tentative wag. "We're making progress, aren't we, boy?" Bobby murmured, then froze as a realization struck him. Webb's reaction at the library hadn't been professional concern. It had been fear, personal, desperate fear that went far beyond community safety. Bobby's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Dot's voice came through clear and worried. "Bobby, I just got off the phone with Jennifer at the shelter. Dr. Webb called an emergency meeting with the county commissioners. He's pushing for Thor to be removed from your home immediately." "On what grounds?" "Public safety. He's claiming Thor poses an imminent threat and that the shelter made an error in the adoption process." Dot's voice lowered. "Bobby, there's something else. Jennifer found some old intake records in the storage room. Thor wasn't brought in as a stray like they told us." Bobby's grip tightened on the phone. "What do you mean?" "He was surrendered by someone specific. Someone who signed papers claiming he'd attacked a child." Dot paused, her breathing audible. "The signature on those papers belongs to Dr. Marcus Webb." The information hit Bobby like a physical blow. He looked at Thor, who was watching him with those intelligent amber eyes, and pieces began clicking into place. Webb's passionate opposition to Thor's adoption, his detailed knowledge of the dog's supposed aggression, his visceral reaction to seeing the therapy dog certification. "Dot, I need you to do something for me," Bobby said, his voice steady despite the implications racing through his mind. "Can you get me copies of those intake papers? And anything else you can find about Thor's surrender?" "Already on it." "Jennifer's making copies tonight, but Bobby, be careful. If Webb went to the trouble of getting rid of Thor once, he won't hesitate to do it again." After hanging up, Bobby sat on his kitchen floor next to Thor, letting the dog's solid presence ground him while his mind processed this new information. Martha's voice echoed in his memory. "The truth has a way of surfacing, Bobby. Sometimes it just needs someone brave enough to go looking for it." "What really happened to you, boy?" Bobby whispered, running his hand along Thor's scarred back. "And what is Marcus Webb so afraid of?" Thor leaned against Bobby's leg, offering comfort as if sensing the storm clouds gathering around their fragile new life. Outside, the February wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the darkness, forces were already moving to tear them apart before the truth could set them both free. The next morning would bring revelations that would shake Willowbrook to its foundations, but for now, man and dog sat together in the quiet kitchen, two damaged souls finding strength in their shared determination to survive whatever came next. The manila envelope arrived at Bobby's doorstep before dawn, delivered by Jennifer Walsh under cover of darkness like contraband in wartime. Inside, photocopied documents told a story that made Bobby's hands shake as he read by the kitchen window's pale light. Thor's surrender papers, dated 8 months ago, bore Dr. Marcus Webb's signature in bold black ink. But it was the handwritten incident report that stopped Bobby's breath entirely. Subject animal attacked minor child, female, age 9, during authorized therapy session. Webb had written. Unprovoked aggression resulting in lacerations requiring medical attention. Animal deemed unsuitable for therapeutic work and poses significant danger to children. Recommend immediate behavioral euthanasia. Bobby studied the clinical language, his teacher's instincts recognizing the careful construction of each phrase. 40 years of reading incident reports had taught him to spot the difference between factual documentation and creative narrative. This read like the latter. By 8 o'clock, Dot had arrived with coffee and righteous indignation. "That man's been lying through his teeth," she declared, spreading additional documents across Bobby's kitchen table. "I did some digging last night. Called my friend Helen, who works at County Records." The additional paperwork painted a disturbing picture. Webb's veterinary clinic had been struggling financially for 2 years, weighed down by mounting debts and insurance claims. More troubling were the medical records Dot had managed to obtain through her nursing connections. Sophie Webb's treatment history showed multiple emergency room visits in the months before Thor's surrender, but none of the injuries matched dog bite patterns. "Look at this." Dot pointed to a hospital report dated 3 days before Thor's surrender. Sophie came in with bruises on her upper arms, consistent with gripping injuries. The attending physician noted behavioral indicators of psychological trauma, no mention of any animal attack. Bobby felt sick as the implications crystallized. He surrendered Thor to cover up his own abuse. Their investigation was interrupted by the doorbell's insistent chime. Through the front window, Bobby could see Principal Anderson from Willowbrook Elementary, accompanied by 2 county commissioners and Dr. Webb himself. Thor immediately tensed, positioning himself between Bobby and the front door with a low growl that spoke of genuine recognition rather than general wariness. "Easy, boy," Bobby murmured, but he understood Thor's reaction perfectly now. The dog remembered Webb, and the memory was nothing but pain. The confrontation on Bobby's front porch crackled with barely contained hostility. Commissioner Bradley, a heavy-set man who'd been calling for budget cuts across all county services, spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Mr. Sullivan, we're here regarding the animal you adopted from county facilities," Bradley announced. "Dr. Webb has presented compelling evidence that this adoption was processed in error." "What evidence?" Bobby asked, though he kept his voice level despite the anger building in his chest. Webb stepped forward, his professional demeanor masking the anxiety Bobby could now see beneath the surface. "New information has come to light regarding this animal's behavioral history. Information that wasn't available during the adoption process." "You mean information you deliberately withheld?" Bobby replied. "Because according to the surrender documents you signed, you knew exactly what Thor's background was when you brought him to the shelter." The accusation hit its mark. Webb's face flushed, and for a moment his composed facade cracked. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," Bobby interrupted. "I'm stating facts. You surrendered a certified therapy dog to the county shelter, claiming he attacked your daughter. But hospital records show Sophie's injuries were inconsistent with dog bites. They were consistent with human grip marks." Principal Anderson stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Mr. Sullivan, these are serious allegations. They're serious truths." Dot's voice cut through the tension as she emerged from Bobby's house, arms full of documentation. "And we have the evidence to prove it." The next hour unfolded like a legal proceeding conducted on a suburban lawn. Dot presented hospital records, veterinary reports, and timeline inconsistencies with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent decades documenting patient care. Webb's story began unraveling thread by thread, his professional authority crumbling under the weight of contradictory evidence. The breaking point came when Commissioner Bradley demanded to see Thor directly. "If this animal is as gentle as you claim, prove it." Bobby hesitated, knowing that Thor's reaction to Webb could either vindicate or condemn them both. But as he opened the front door, something unexpected happened. Thor emerged calmly, approached each stranger with cautious but non-aggressive curiosity, and sat perfectly beside Bobby's feet. Only when his eyes found Webb did his demeanor change, not to aggression, but to something far more heartbreaking. The confident therapy dog posture dissolved into the cowering submission of an animal that had learned to expect pain from a specific source. "Jesus Christ," Commissioner Bradley muttered, understanding flooding his features. "That dog's afraid of you, Webb." Why is a supposedly aggressive animal afraid of the man claiming to be his victim? Webb's composure finally shattered completely. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. Sophie was having one of her episodes, screaming, hitting herself, completely out of control. I just grabbed her arms to stop her from hurting herself, and the damn dog wouldn't let me help my own daughter. The confession hung in the spring air like a physical presence. Webb seemed to realize what he'd admitted, but the words couldn't be recalled. Principal Anderson's face had gone pale with the implications of what they'd just heard. "So Thor was protecting Sophie," Bobby said quietly. "From you." "I wasn't hurting her," Webb protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "I was trying to help, but every time I tried to calm her down, that dog would get between us. He made everything worse." Dot stepped forward with the gentle authority of someone who'd spent 3 decades managing psychiatric crises. "Marcus, forcing control over an autistic child during a meltdown often escalates the situation. The dog was doing exactly what he was trained to do, providing a calming presence and protective barrier." The revelation that followed would haunt Bobby for months afterward. Webb's breakdown was complete now. Years of suppressed guilt and defensive rage pouring out in desperate justifications. His son, Sophie's older brother, had died in a drowning accident 5 years earlier while Webb was distracted by a veterinary emergency. The guilt had consumed him, transformed his relationship with Sophie into a desperate need to control every aspect of her safety. "I couldn't lose her too," Webb sobbed, "but she wouldn't let me help her. She'd only calm down for that damn dog. She trusted him more than she trusted her own father." The psychology was devastatingly clear to anyone who'd worked with trauma victims. Webb's inability to help his daughter, combined with his guilt over his son's death, had manifested as resentment toward the one being who could provide Sophie the comfort he couldn't. When Thor had intervened during Webb's increasingly desperate attempts to help Sophie through her autism-related meltdowns, the veterinarian had seen it as a personal failure rather than professional success. Commissioner Bradley's radio crackled to life, county dispatch requesting his location for an emergency call. But before he could respond, a car door slammed in Bobby's driveway. Carol Patterson emerged from her sedan, her face flushed with urgency and something that looked like hope. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she called, approaching the group, "but I need Dr. Webb to see something." She held up a manila folder thick with documents. "I've been reviewing Sophie's school records, and I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding about what happened." The folder contained 2 years' worth of Sophie's educational assessments, behavioral reports, and therapy session notes. The documentation painted a picture of a child who had thrived under Thor's care, making unprecedented progress in communication and emotional regulation. Her teachers had noted remarkable improvements in focus, reduced anxiety, and increased social interaction, all directly correlated with Thor's presence in her therapeutic routine. "The incident that led to Thor's removal," Carol continued, her voice gaining strength, "wasn't documented the way it actually happened. I have witness statements from staff members who were present." She pulled out a typed report that made Webb's face go ashen. "Thor didn't attack Sophie. When you grabbed her during her meltdown, she began self-harming behaviors, hitting herself, pulling her hair. Thor gently inserted himself between you and Sophie, using his body to prevent her from continuing the self-injury. You fell backward over a chair, sustaining minor injuries. Thor never showed aggression. He was performing exactly as trained. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Webb's ragged breathing. His entire narrative, carefully constructed over 8 months of lies and self-justification, had crumbled in the space of 10 minutes. "Where is Sophie now?" Bobby asked gently, recognizing that the real victim in this tragedy was a 10-year-old girl who'd lost both her protector and her father's emotional stability. "Foster care," Webb whispered. I lost custody last month. The state says I need psychological evaluation and anger management before I can see her again." The human cost of Webb's deception was staggering. Sophie had been separated not only from Thor, but from her father, placed in a system that couldn't provide the specialized care her autism required. Thor had been condemned as dangerous, nearly executed for the crime of protecting a vulnerable child. Bobby and countless other families had been denied access to a therapeutic resource that could have transformed lives. Commissioner Bradley's radio crackled again, this time with news that would add another layer of urgency to their confrontation. "All units to Willowbrook Elementary," the dispatcher announced. "Missing child report. 10-year-old female, special needs, last seen leaving foster home early this morning." The missing child was Sophie Webb, and everyone present understood with terrible clarity that a traumatized autistic girl was somewhere in Willowbrook searching for the only source of comfort and safety she'd ever known. A therapy dog that had been branded dangerous and hidden away from the world that needed him most. The search for Sophie Webb began within minutes of the radio dispatch, but it was Thor who provided the first crucial lead. As Bobby grabbed his car keys, the German Shepherd bolted toward the front door with an urgency that transcended normal canine behavior. His nose worked the air frantically, and when Bobby opened the door, Thor immediately headed east toward the old industrial section of Willowbrook, where the abandoned steel mill cast long shadows over empty lots and forgotten dreams. "He knows where she is," Bobby said, his voice tight with certainty as he addressed the impromptu search party that had formed on his lawn. Commissioner Bradley coordinated with county dispatch while Principal Anderson organized parent volunteers. Dr. Webb stood apart from the group, his professional authority evaporated, replaced by the raw desperation of a father whose mistakes had endangered his child. The abandoned Willowbrook steelworks sprawled across 40 acres of rusted infrastructure and environmental hazard. The county had fenced the property after the closure, but determined children had found countless ways through the barriers over the years. Now, as search teams spread across the grounds, the vastness of the space and the danger it represented became terrifyingly apparent. Thor led Bobby through a gap in the chain-link fence that had been worn smooth by repeated use. Inside the compound, the German Shepherd's behavior shifted into what Bobby now recognized as full therapeutic mode, alert but calm, focused but not frantic. This was a dog doing exactly what he'd been trained to do: locate and assist a child in crisis. "Sophie!" Bobby called, his voice echoing off the rusted machinery. "It's Mr. Sullivan from school. Thor is here with me." The response came not as words, but as a sound that broke Bobby's heart, a keening wail that spoke of pure terror and confusion. Thor's ears pricked forward, and he led Bobby deeper into the maze of abandoned equipment toward what had once been the mill's administrative building. They found Sophie in the building's basement, huddled in a corner behind an overturned desk. Her small body shook with the violence of a panic attack, her hands pressed against her ears to block out sounds only she could hear. The autism that made her brilliant in controlled environments had become her enemy in this chaotic, unfamiliar space. "Easy, sweetheart," Bobby said, lowering himself to the concrete floor 20 feet away. "I'm not going to come any closer, but I brought someone who's been missing you very much." Thor's transformation was instantaneous and profound. The careful reserve he'd maintained around adults melted away as he approached Sophie with the gentle confidence of a professional caregiver. He didn't rush toward her or demand attention. Instead, he positioned himself within her field of vision and lay down, making himself small and non-threatening. Sophie's hands slowly lowered from her ears. Through her tears, she saw the distinctive white scar across Thor's left eye, the familiar black and tan markings that had been her constant companion during the darkest periods of her young life. "Thor?" she whispered, her voice broken by months of separation and trauma. The reunion that followed defied every narrative Dr. Webb had constructed about his daughter's relationship with the dangerous dog. Thor approached Sophie with exquisite care, allowing her to bury her face in his thick coat while he remained perfectly still. Her sobs gradually quieted as Thor's presence worked its therapeutic magic, his body warmth and steady breathing providing the sensory input her overwhelmed nervous system desperately needed. "I've been looking for you," Sophie mumbled into Thor's fur. "Daddy said you went away because you were bad, but I knew that wasn't true. You're the goodest boy. You're my goodest boy." Bobby felt tears sting his eyes as he witnessed the profound bond between child and therapy dog, a relationship that had been severed by adult fears and misunderstandings. Through his radio, he could hear search teams combing other sections of the mill complex, unaware that the crisis was already resolving itself in a basement corner where love had proven stronger than months of forced separation. The sound of footsteps on the basement stairs announced the arrival of the main search party. Dr. Webb appeared first, his face a mask of relief and guilt as he saw his daughter safe. Behind him came Principal Anderson, Commissioner Bradley, and several parent volunteers who'd insisted on joining the search despite the potential dangers. Sophie's reaction to seeing her father was immediate and devastating. She pressed closer to Thor, her small hands gripping his fur as her body tensed with renewed anxiety. The dog responded by positioning himself more protectively, not aggressively, but as a clear barrier between Sophie and the source of her distress. "Sophie, honey, it's okay," Webb said, his voice thick with emotion. "Daddy's here. You're safe now." But Sophie's response revealed the depth of damage that had been done. "I don't want to go back," she said, her words muffled against Thor's coat. "I want to stay with Thor. He doesn't get angry when I can't be good." The accusation hit Webb like a physical blow. Commissioner Bradley and the other adults exchanged uncomfortable glances as the implications of Sophie's words sank in. This wasn't just about a dog being mislabeled as dangerous. It was about a father whose inability to cope with his daughter's autism had created trauma that extended far beyond the original incident. "Sophie," Principal Anderson said gently, "everyone's been very worried about you. Your foster family, your teachers, all of us. We need to get you somewhere safe and warm." "I am safe," Sophie replied, with the absolute certainty that only children possess. "Thor keeps me safe. He always keeps me safe." Bobby watched the standoff develop, understanding that this moment would determine not just Sophie's immediate future, but the trajectory of multiple lives intersecting in this basement. Thor remained calm but vigilant, clearly prepared to maintain his protective position for as long as Sophie needed him. "Dr. Webb," Bobby said carefully, "maybe we should let Sophie and Thor have a few more minutes together while we sort out the logistics upstairs." But Webb was already moving forward, his paternal instincts overriding his judgment. "Sophie, you need to come with me right now. This place isn't safe, and neither is that dog." Sophie's panic attack returned with devastating intensity. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, her hands began the repetitive movements that signaled sensory overload, and she started the high-pitched keening that had first led them to her location. Thor immediately shifted into crisis response mode, using his body to provide deep pressure therapy while remaining absolutely still. "Stop!" Dot's voice cut through the chaos as she descended the basement stairs. "Everyone stop moving and be quiet!" The psychiatric nurse's authority was unmistakable, and even Commissioner Bradley found himself obeying her command. Dot surveyed the situation with professional calm, then addressed Sophie directly. "Honey, I can see that you and Thor have missed each other very much," she said, her voice gentle but clear. "And I can see that he's helping you feel better right now. But we need to get you both somewhere warm and safe." "Would it be okay if Thor came with us?" Sophie looked up for the first time, her tear-streaked face filled with desperate hope. "Thor can come too?" "Thor can come too," Dot confirmed, shooting a warning glance at Dr. Webb that clearly communicated the consequences of contradicting her statement. The logistics of moving Sophie and Thor from the basement required careful coordination. Sophie's autism made sudden transitions extremely difficult, and her current state of distress amplified every challenge. It took 40 minutes of patient negotiation before she agreed to leave the basement, and only with Thor walking directly beside her and Bobby providing a calm presence on her other side. The ascent to ground level revealed the scope of the search operation that had mobilized around Sophie's disappearance. Police cars, fire department vehicles, and volunteer searchers had converged on the steel mill complex. Local news crews had arrived, drawn by the story of a missing autistic child and the community's response to her crisis. But the real drama was unfolding in the conversations between officials who now understood the full scope of Dr. Webb's deception. County Child Services had been notified, and a social worker was en route to assess Sophie's needs and determine appropriate placement. Commissioner Bradley was coordinating with the district attorney's office about potential charges related to filing false reports and animal abuse. As they emerged from the administrative building, Sophie, walking between Bobby and Thor like they were her personal security detail, the crowd of searchers broke into spontaneous applause. But Sophie barely acknowledged the attention, her entire focus concentrated on maintaining contact with Thor's reassuring presence. "Doctor." Webb watched from the edge of the crowd, his professional reputation in ruins, his relationship with his daughter damaged perhaps beyond repair. The veterinarian, who had once commanded respect throughout Willowbrook, now faced the reality that his attempts to control his daughter's autism had driven her to seek comfort from the very animal he'd tried to destroy. The drive back to town proceeded in convoy formation, with Sophie and Thor riding together in Bobby's car, while official vehicles provided escort. Sophie had finally stopped crying, but she maintained constant physical contact with Thor, her small hand buried in his thick coat as he provided the sensory input her overwhelmed nervous system required. "Mr. Sullivan," Sophie said quietly as they approached the town center, "is Thor going to have to go back to the sad place?" Bobby met her eyes in the rear-view mirror, seeing Martha's compassion reflected in his own response. "No, sweetheart. Thor's never going back to the sad place. He's got a family now, and families stick together." The promise was made before Bobby fully understood its implications, but as Thor's tail wagged for the first time since they'd left the steel mill, Bobby realized that some commitments transcended practical considerations. Whatever legal battles lay ahead, whatever challenges Sophie's placement would present, whatever consequences Dr. Webb would face for his deception, those were tomorrow's problems. Today, a lost little girl had been found, a therapy dog had proven his worth beyond any doubt, and a community had learned the difference between fear and understanding. The foundation for healing had been laid in a basement corner where love had proven stronger than months of enforced separation. As the convoy pulled up to Willowbrook Elementary, where temporary crisis services had been established, Bobby understood that this moment marked not just the end of Sophie's immediate crisis, but the beginning of a much larger transformation that would reshape multiple lives and perhaps an entire community's understanding of what it meant to protect and serve its most vulnerable members. The temporary custody hearing took place in the Willowbrook Elementary Library 3 days after Sophie's rescue, converted into an emergency courtroom when the county courthouse's elevator broke down. Judge Patricia Morrison, a woman in her 60s who'd presided over family court for 20 years, understood that some cases required flexibility in both venue and procedure. What she hadn't expected was the emotional complexity of a case involving a therapy dog, an abusive father, and a community that had rallied around a child they barely knew. Sophie sat between Bobby and Dot at a small table, her hand resting on Thor's head as he lay quietly beside her chair. The German Shepherd wore a new red therapy dog vest that Principal Anderson had ordered overnight, complete with official certification patches that documented his legitimate status. For the first time since the crisis began, Sophie appeared calm, though she hadn't spoken more than a few words since leaving the steel mill. Dr. Webb occupied a table across the room with his court-appointed attorney, a young public defender who looked overwhelmed by the case's publicity and complexity. The veterinarian's professional composure had crumbled entirely in the 3 days since his deception was exposed. Local news coverage had been devastating, focusing on his role in separating a traumatized child from her therapy animal and the near execution of a certified service dog based on false claims. This hearing will determine temporary placement for Sophie Webb, age 10, pending a full investigation into allegations of child endangerment and filing false police reports, Judge Morrison announced. However, given the unusual circumstances involving a therapy animal, I'm prepared to consider non-traditional solutions if they serve the child's best interests. The state's child protection attorney, Miranda Hayes, presented the case for immediate foster placement with a family trained in autism care. Your Honor, while we appreciate the community's concern for Sophie Webb, proper protocol requires placement with certified providers who understand her specific needs. Emotional bonds, while touching, cannot override safety requirements and professional standards. Hayes outlined Sophie's medical history, educational needs, and the specialized care requirements that her autism demanded. The presentation was thorough, professional, and utterly devoid of recognition that Sophie was a human being rather than a case file. When she concluded by recommending that the animal component be phased out gradually to avoid dependency, Sophie's reaction was immediate and visceral. The 10-year-old's panic attack erupted without warning. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. Her hands began the repetitive flapping motions that signaled severe distress, and the high-pitched keening sound that had led searchers to her location 3 days earlier filled the library. Thor responded instantly, rising from his position and providing pressure therapy by leaning against Sophie's legs while maintaining perfect calm despite the chaos around them. "Stop!" Judge Morrison commanded as Hayes started to continue her presentation. "Everyone be quiet and give the child space." The courtroom watched in amazement as Thor worked his therapeutic magic. Without any commands or guidance, he positioned his body to provide the sensory input Sophie needed, his presence gradually calming her nervous system until her breathing returned to normal. The demonstration was more powerful than any expert testimony could have been. "Ms. Hayes," Judge Morrison said when Sophie had fully recovered, "your recommendation just triggered a severe medical episode in this child. The therapy animal prevented it from escalating into a full crisis. Perhaps we should reconsider the value of that relationship." Bobby stood carefully, his recent cancer diagnosis making sudden movements difficult. "Your Honor, I'd like to request permission to speak on Sophie's behalf." The request was unusual. Bobby had no legal standing in the case, but Judge Morrison had presided over enough family tragedies to recognize genuine advocacy when she saw it. "Mr. Sullivan, you may address the court." Bobby's 40 years of teaching experience served him well as he addressed the makeshift courtroom. He spoke about Sophie's academic records, her remarkable progress under Thor's care, and the devastating regression that had followed their forced separation. He presented documentation from teachers, therapists, and medical professionals who had witnessed the therapeutic partnership's success. "Your Honor, this isn't about a little girl who likes dogs," Bobby concluded. "This is about a specialized medical relationship that has been severed by false accusations and adult failures. Sophie doesn't need to be separated from Thor. She needs to be reunited with the therapeutic support that allows her to function in the world." Dr. Webb's attorney attempted to present a defense based on his client's grief over his son's death and his misguided attempts to protect Sophie from perceived dangers. The narrative of a grieving father making poor decisions might have generated sympathy under different circumstances, but the evidence of sustained deception and the dramatic demonstration of Thor's therapeutic value had shifted the courtroom's mood decisively. "Dr. Webb," Judge Morrison addressed him directly, "you surrendered a certified therapy dog to county animal control with false claims of aggression. You maintained those lies for 8 months while your daughter's condition deteriorated in foster care. You've created a situation where a child has been traumatized by separation from her primary therapeutic support. What do you have to say for yourself?" Webb's response revealed the depth of his psychological damage. "I couldn't help her," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "After Michael died, I couldn't bear the thought of losing Sophie too. Every time she had an episode, I felt like I was failing her the same way I failed my son. When that dog could calm her down when I couldn't, it felt like proof that I was a terrible father." The confession hung in the air like a physical presence. Judge Morrison had heard many tragic stories during her tenure, but the spectacle of a father's love becoming so twisted by grief that it endangered the child he was trying to protect struck her as particularly heartbreaking. "Dr. Webb, your intentions may have been loving, but your actions have caused immeasurable harm to your daughter and to an innocent animal. You will undergo mandatory psychological evaluation and treatment before any contact with Sophie is considered." The judge turned her attention to the question of Sophie's placement, weighing the complex factors that traditional family court rarely encountered. The state advocated for institutional care that could address Sophie's autism, but ignored her specific therapeutic needs. The community offered love and support but lacked formal certification for special needs care. "Sophie," Judge Morrison addressed the child directly, "this is your life we're talking about. Is there anything you want to tell me?" Sophie looked up from Thor's comforting presence, her voice small but clear. "I want to stay with Mr. Sullivan and Mrs. Dot. They understand about Thor. They understand that he's not just a dog, he's my helper." The simple statement carried the weight of absolute truth. In a courtroom full of adults debating custody arrangements and therapeutic protocols, a 10-year-old had articulated the core issue with perfect clarity. Understanding and acceptance were more valuable than credentials and procedures. Judge Morrison spent 20 minutes reviewing the case files, custody statutes, and precedent law before announcing her decision. "This case presents unusual circumstances that require creative solutions. I'm granting temporary custody to Dorothy Henderson, with Robert Sullivan serving as primary educational advocate and Thor continuing as Sophie's certified therapy animal." The decision sent shock waves through the courtroom. Hayes immediately objected, citing regulations and procedures that weren't designed for such arrangements. Webb's attorney protested that his client's parental rights were being ignored. Even Bobby and Dot seemed stunned by the unconventional ruling. "My decision is based on one simple principle," Judge Morrison explained. "This child's welfare is paramount, and the evidence clearly shows that she thrives in the presence of her therapy animal and these particular caregivers. We will review this arrangement in 90 days, but for now, Sophie Webb will remain where she is healthiest and happiest. The aftermath of the hearing brought both celebration and challenge. Sophie's placement with DOT required extensive paperwork, background checks, and home modifications to meet state requirements for foster care. Bobby's role as educational advocate meant coordinating with school officials, therapists, and medical professionals to ensure Sophie's academic and therapeutic needs were met. The most significant change, however, was in Thor himself. The German Shepherd, who had spent 8 months labeled as dangerous and nearly faced execution, was now officially recognized as a certified therapy animal with full access to schools, hospitals, and other facilities where his skills were needed. The transformation from most hated dog to community hero was complete, but it came with responsibilities that would test every bond formed during the crisis. As they left the makeshift courtroom, Sophie walking between her new guardians with Thor at her side, the little girl made an observation that would resonate through Willowbrook for months to come. Sometimes grown-ups make things too complicated. Thor just loves people, and people should just love him back. The wisdom of a 10-year-old, delivered with the clarity that only trauma and recovery could provide, would guide a community's understanding of what truly mattered when society's most vulnerable members needed protection and care. 3 weeks after the custody hearing, Bobby's world collapsed in the oncology ward of Willowbrook General Hospital. The chest X-rays that Dr. Patricia Chen spread across the light board told a story that no amount of hope or determination could rewrite. The small spots in Bobby's lungs had multiplied and grown, transforming his early-stage diagnosis into something far more aggressive and unforgiving. "I'm sorry, Bobby," Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying the weight of delivering news she'd given too many times before. "The cancer has metastasized faster than we anticipated. With aggressive treatment, we might be looking at 6 to 8 months. Without treatment, perhaps 3. Bobby stared at the images of his own mortality, feeling the familiar ache in his chest that he'd attributed to grief but now understood was his body's rebellion against itself. Thor sat beside the hospital chair, his presence somehow more essential than ever, as Bobby absorbed the implications of Dr. Chen's prognosis. "What about Sophie?" Bobby asked, his teacher's instincts immediately focusing on his student's welfare rather than his own mortality. "What happens to her when I can't be her advocate anymore?" The question that haunted Bobby extended far beyond Sophie's immediate care. In the 3 weeks since the custody hearing, their unconventional family had developed rhythms and relationships that defied easy categorization. Sophie had started speaking more, attending school regularly, and showing academic progress that amazed her teachers. Thor had begun working with other children in the district, his reputation as a therapeutic miracle spreading throughout the county. But all of it depended on Bobby's presence as the steady center that held the arrangement together. Dot, at 72, couldn't manage Sophie's complex needs indefinitely. The state would eventually require more traditional custody arrangements. And Thor, despite his newfound status as a therapy dog, remained legally Bobby's responsibility. The drive home from the hospital passed in contemplative silence, broken only by Sophie's excited chatter about her day at school. She'd made a friend, another girl with autism who'd been inspired by Sophie's confidence in advocating for her needs. Thor had spent the afternoon working with a kindergarten class where his presence had helped 3 children overcome their fear of reading aloud. "Mr. Bobby, are you sick?" Sophie asked as they pulled into the driveway, her autistic intuition picking up on subtle changes in Bobby's behavior that others might miss. Bobby turned to look at her, seeing Martha's compassion reflected in his own response. "I am sick, sweetheart. But that doesn't change anything about us being a family. Families stick together through the hard times." That evening, Bobby made the most difficult phone call of his life. His daughter Jennifer lived in Seattle with her husband and 2 children, building a life that had little room for an aging father and his complicated circumstances. They'd spoken perhaps a dozen times since Martha's funeral, their relationship polite but distant. "Dad, I've been reading about what's happening there," Jennifer said after Bobby explained his diagnosis. "The news coverage about you and that dog, I had no idea you were going through all this." Bobby heard something in his daughter's voice that he hadn't detected in years, genuine concern mixed with regret for the distance that had grown between them. "Jenny, I need you to know that I don't expect anything from you. But there are people here who depend on me, and I need to make arrangements." The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours and covered ground that father and daughter hadn't explored since Jennifer's teenage years. She learned about Bobby's depression after Martha's death, his near suicide, the way Thor and Sophie had given him purpose when he'd abandoned hope. Bobby learned about Jennifer's struggles as a working mother, her guilt over not being present during Martha's illness, her fear that she'd inherited her father's capacity for emotional withdrawal. "I can't take a therapy dog, Dad," Jennifer said finally. "Our apartment doesn't allow pets, and with 2 kids and full-time jobs—" "I'm not asking you to," Bobby interrupted. "Thor belongs here with Sophie and the work we've started. I just need to know that when the time comes, someone will make sure they're protected." The complexity of Bobby's situation became clearer over the following days as he began putting his affairs in order. Thor's legal status as a therapy dog required continuous certification and supervision by qualified handlers. Sophie's placement with Dot was temporary at best, dependent on regular reviews and state approval. The therapeutic program they'd begun at Willowbrook Elementary needed institutional support to continue beyond Bobby's involvement. Dr. Webb's unexpected phone call came on a Tuesday evening as Bobby sat in his backyard watching Sophie teach Thor a new trick. The veterinarian's voice carried a weight of guilt and desperation that had only deepened in the weeks since the custody hearing. "Sullivan, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from," Webb began. "But I've been thinking about what I owe Sophie. What I owe all of you after what I did." Bobby listened as Webb outlined a proposal that was both shocking and potentially transformative. The veterinarian had been working with a team of psychologists and animal behaviorists to develop a formal therapeutic animal program that could serve not just Willowbrook but the entire county. He'd liquidated his personal assets to fund the initial phases, viewing it as restitution for the damage his lies had caused. "I can't undo what I did to Sophie, or to Thor, or to you," Webb continued. "But I can use my professional knowledge to create something that ensures no other child loses access to therapeutic support because of adult failures." The proposal included establishing a nonprofit foundation that would train and certify therapy animals, provide ongoing support for families like Sophie's, and create sustainable funding for programs that traditional healthcare often ignored. Webb's veterinary expertise, combined with his newfound understanding of therapeutic relationships, could potentially revolutionize how the community approached mental health support for children with special needs. "Why are you telling me this?" Bobby asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Because you're the only person who understands what these relationships really mean," Webb replied. "And because I need your help to make it work. Thor's story, Sophie's recovery, your advocacy, that's the foundation everything else needs to build on." The irony wasn't lost on Bobby that the man who'd nearly destroyed Thor was now proposing to build an empire around therapeutic animal relationships. But Martha's voice echoed in his memory. "People can change, Bobby, especially when they understand the true cost of their mistakes." Bobby's cancer diagnosis leaked to the community within days, despite his attempts to keep the information private. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Former students organized fundraisers for experimental treatments, parents volunteered to help with Sophie's care, and fellow teachers created meal trains that extended weeks into the future. But the most meaningful support came from unexpected sources. Dr. Webb arrived at Bobby's house on Saturday morning with architectural drawings and zoning permits for the Willowbrook Therapeutic Animal Center. The proposed facility would house training programs, provide respite care for families with special needs children, and serve as a permanent home for therapy animals like Thor, who needed specialized care and handling. "The building is donated," Webb explained, spreading the plans across Bobby's kitchen table, while Sophie and Thor examined the drawings with intense interest. "Former Hartley Manufacturing Warehouse, already zoned for educational use. Insurance and operating costs are covered for the first 5 years through a foundation trust." Sophie traced the outlines of the proposed dog runs and therapy rooms with her finger, her excitement building as she understood the implications. "Thor would have his own office?" she asked, pointing to a space marked Primary Therapy Animal Suite. "Thor would be the Director of Therapeutic Services," Webb confirmed, his voice catching slightly as he watched Sophie's reaction. "With full staff support and everything he needs to help other children the way he's helped you." The proposal represented more than just a charitable endeavor. It was a complete transformation of how the community viewed therapeutic relationships and the support systems required to maintain them. But for Bobby, facing his own mortality, it meant something even more precious: the certainty that Thor and Sophie would be protected and valued long after he was gone. As he signed the preliminary agreements that would transfer Thor's care to the foundation and ensure Sophie's continued access to therapeutic support, Bobby felt a peace he hadn't experienced since Martha's death. The work they'd begun together, man, dog, and child, would continue and grow, touching lives and healing wounds throughout a community that had learned to recognize the difference between fear and understanding. 6 months later, Bobby Sullivan stood at the podium of the newly completed Willowbrook Therapeutic Animal Center, his voice stronger than anyone had expected when Dr. Chen had delivered his terminal diagnosis. The experimental immunotherapy treatment funded by community donations had exceeded all medical predictions, shrinking the tumors in his lungs and buying him time that felt like borrowed grace. Behind him, Thor sat proudly wearing his official Director of Therapeutic Services vest, while Sophie, now 11 and radiant with confidence, prepared to cut the ribbon that would officially open the facility. The crowd gathered for the dedication ceremony represented a community transformed. Parents who had once feared Thor now brought their own children seeking his help. Former students of Bobby's, now adults with families of their own, had traveled from across the country to witness the culmination of a story that had begun with despair and bloomed into hope. Even Judge Morrison was present, her unconventional custody decision having created legal precedent that was now studied in family law programs nationwide. 9 months ago, Bobby began, his teacher's voice carrying easily across the assembled crowd, I walked into the Willowbrook Animal Shelter asking for the most hated dog they had. I thought I was saving him, but as it turned out, he was saving me. The story that unfolded in Bobby's dedication speech had already become legend in Willowbrook, but hearing it told in its entirety, from Thor's near execution to his transformation into a therapeutic miracle, moved the audience to tears and spontaneous applause. Sophie listened from her place of honor beside Dr. Webb, who had slowly rebuilt his relationship with his daughter through months of supervised visits and family therapy. Webb's own transformation had been as remarkable as Thor's redemption. The veterinarian who had once abused his authority to separate a child from her therapy animal now served as the center's chief medical officer. His expertise in animal behavior combined with his hard-won understanding of therapeutic relationships. His work developing standardized protocols for therapy animal certification was being adopted by facilities across the state. The most important lesson we've learned, Bobby continued, is that healing rarely happens in isolation. Thor needed Sophie as much as she needed him. I needed both of them to find my way back to life. And our community needed to confront its own fears and prejudices to become the place we always claimed to be. As Sophie stepped forward to cut the ribbon, her movement triggered a chain reaction of joy and celebration. Thor's tail wagged with the enthusiasm of a dog who finally understood his place in the world. Dot Henderson wiped tears from her eyes, her lonely widowhood transformed into the purposeful role of grandmother and community elder. Jennifer Sullivan stood beside her father, having moved back to Willowbrook with her family to be part of the center's expansion plans. The ribbon fell away to reveal the bronze plaque that would greet visitors for generations to come. The Willowbrook Therapeutic Animal Center, where every soul deserves a second chance. Below the dedication, a smaller inscription read, "In honor of Thor, who taught us that the most unwanted can become the most essential." The center's first day of operations demonstrated the profound impact of Thor's story on the broader community. 12 therapy animals, all trained using protocols developed from Thor's case, were matched with children and adults facing various challenges. A young veteran with PTSD found comfort with a golden retriever named Hope. An elderly man recovering from stroke worked with a patient border collie who helped him relearn basic motor skills. 3 children with autism, inspired by Sophie's advocacy, began their own therapeutic relationships. But it was the return of an unexpected visitor that provided the day's most poignant moment. Carol Manning, the former school aide who had witnessed the original incident between Thor and Dr. Webb, arrived with her grandson, a 7-year-old boy with selective mutism who hadn't spoken in public since starting school. "I knew if anyone could help Tyler find his voice, it would be Thor," Carol explained as she watched her grandson approach the German Shepherd with cautious interest. Within 20 minutes, Tyler was whispering commands to Thor, his selective mutism overcome by the dog's patient presence and unconditional acceptance. Dr. Webb watched the interaction from across the therapy room, his professional assessment mixed with personal redemption. "That's exactly what Thor was doing with Sophie," he told Bobby quietly. "I was too blinded by my own fears to see that he was helping her communicate, not enabling her dependence." The center's success in its first months exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Referrals came from schools, hospitals, and social service agencies throughout the region. Research universities sent graduate students to study the protocols developed around Thor's case. A documentary crew arrived to film the story of the most hated dog who became a community's healing catalyst. But the true measure of success was visible in the individual transformations occurring daily within the center's walls. Sophie had become a peer mentor for younger children with autism, her confidence and communication skills inspiring families who'd been told their children would never achieve independence. Thor's work expanded beyond individual therapy to include classroom visits, reading programs, and crisis intervention services. Bobby's health remained stable but precarious, each good day a gift that allowed him to witness the ripple effects of their unlikely partnership. His relationship with Jennifer had deepened through their shared involvement in the center's operations, and his role as grandfather to her children had filled the family void that Martha's death had created. On a quiet Sunday evening in December, as snow fell gently outside the center's windows, Bobby sat in his favorite therapy room, watching Sophie read to a group of younger children while Thor provided his calming presence. The scene embodied everything Martha had believed about the power of love to transform even the most broken situations. "You know what the best part is?" Sophie said as she closed the book and looked up at Bobby. "Thor doesn't remember being the most hated dog. He just remembers being loved." The observation struck Bobby as profoundly true. Thor's past trauma hadn't disappeared, but it had been overwhelmed by months of positive experiences and purposeful work. The scars remained, the white mark across his eye, the cautious way he approached new situations, but they had become part of his story rather than the whole of his identity. As they walked home through the snow-covered streets of Willowbrook, Bobby reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this point. A community that had once been divided by fear and misunderstanding had learned to embrace difference and celebrate the contributions of its most vulnerable members. A therapy dog who had nearly been executed for protecting a child now served as a beacon of hope for families facing seemingly impossible challenges. The Willowbrook Therapeutic Animal Center stood as a monument to the power of second chances, but more importantly, it represented a new understanding of what community really meant. In a world that often discarded what it didn't understand, Willowbrook had chosen to look deeper, to invest in healing, and to trust that love could triumph over fear. Thor trotted beside Bobby and Sophie through the quiet snow, his tail wagging with the contentment of a dog who had found his purpose. Behind them, the lights of the therapeutic center glowed warmly in the winter darkness, a testament to the truth that sometimes the most unwanted souls carry within them exactly what the world needs most: the capacity to heal, to hope, and to love without conditions or reservations. Dear friends, at 55, 65, or beyond, we often feel like society has written us off. Too old to matter, too set in our ways to change, too damaged by life's disappointments to start over. Bobby Sullivan felt exactly this way at 65, sitting alone with a bottle of pills, convinced his best years were behind him. But sometimes our greatest purpose finds us when we think we have nothing left to give. When Bobby adopted Thor, the most hated dog in the shelter, he wasn't just saving an unwanted animal. He was discovering that broken hearts can still love fiercely, that experience is wisdom waiting to be shared, and that our scars make us qualified to heal others. Thor didn't need someone perfect. He needed someone who understood pain. Sophie didn't need another adult who pitied her autism. She needed advocates who saw her strength. In a youth-obsessed world that discards what it considers damaged, Bobby proved that our second acts can be our greatest performances. Your setbacks haven't disqualified you. They've prepared you for something beautiful you haven't imagined yet. What unwanted part of yourself might actually be your greatest gift to share? Have you ever found purpose in your pain that surprised you? Share your story below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.